Part of it was most people had money, I think, and were able to send their kids to the better schools and live in the better suburbs. And it's funny because I spent most of my career in the news, in the inner city, in the ghetto, and I really grew up as a suburban kid,
Having such a high-achieving mother, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, that was interesting. My mother's had a sister whose husband had a cattle ranch in Montana, and I vacationed there in the summer. And actually, when I was 16, I worked as a cowhand for a summer. And if you'd asked me what I wanted to do when I was 16, I would have probably told you I wanted to be a rancher. I loved the West. I loved wearing a cowboy hat and cowboy boots and riding a horse. And the West is beautiful country with a big sky, and I fell in love with it. And at 16, I probably would have told you that. But I'll tell you, I mentioned that my family was rich in literary skills, I think. And one of my dad's brothers was a newsman in Washington, a pretty legendary guy. And he wrote in his later years, he wrote a column in Washington for many years I think it was called In Town. And my grandparents, who didn't live far from us, used to read his columns to us. And sometimes they'd hang them on the bulletin board in their kitchen or whatever. And you guys are probably too young to remember, but when I was a boy, Davy Crockett was the biggest thing in the world. He was like Elvis or the Beatles or something, everything. He was one of the first guys. Fess Parker, who played Davy Crockett, was one of the first guys who did merchandising, and he had a piece of all that with Disney. And one day, at the height of Davy Crockett's popularity, he was in Washington for something, and my uncle did this column about him because every kid had a raccoon hat and fringe jacket and everything. We all wanted to look like Davy Crockett, And so next to his column, there was a picture of my uncle standing next to Davy Crockett, and I went, "Oh my God, he met Davy Crockett." I said, "That's a job for me, man. If you can spend time with Davy Crockett, that's a neat way to make a living." And I remember that was one of the first interests that I think I had in being a news reporter.
Did you make an effort to make that dream come true?
Well, I was very much into athletics as a kid. I mean, in elementary school, I played football, basketball, and baseball, and track. And in high school, I played football for a few years. And then my brother, who was a track star, I was like third in the league in the half mile. I ran like a 2:04 half mile when I was a sophomore in the Frost Soft division. And my brother told me, I was not a big guy, but I was fast. And he said, you should give up football. I rode the bench most of the time anyway. And he said, you should run cross country, and you might get a scholarship. So I switched to cross country. And he was right. I did. I got a partial scholarship to college, and I ran track and cross country at Miami University in Ohio. And my brother was right about that.
What did your parents say when you tell them you got a scholarship to the University of Miami, Ohio?
Not too much, really. We were all expected to go to college. It made it a little cheaper. But I basically, there were four of us, so we didn't come from a poor family. We're sort of upper middle class. But when you have, two kids in college for a period of about 10 years, we ended up mostly putting ourselves through college, with jobs and scholarships.
What kind of jobs would you have in college? Can you share that with us?
I've had so many. My wife and I were laughing about this the other night. I've had 20 different jobs in my life. I started when I was a kid. I would shovel snow in Chicago. I always had a lawn job in the summer, when I was like in 7th, 8th grade. I caddied like when I was about 13 or 14 at a country club. I waited tables. I was a bus boy. I was a waiter. I was a ranch hand one summer. I shined shoes at a country club once. All kinds of, I was a lifeguard. I had an uncle who had a trucking company, and I spent 2 summers working on a beer truck in Chicago. I can think that. What else?
How did you do athletically in college once there?
I did well. I wasn't the biggest star in the world, but We were very good at cross country. It was the Mid-America Conference at that time. My junior year, we won the Mid-America Conference. We won like the Central States Championship. We won the All-Ohio Championship, and we were like 4th in the nation in the AAU. So we were really good. I was like in cross country, I was like the 3rd man usually. You know, you have 7-man teams in cross country, and you add up your scores, and the lowest scores win the meets. And I was good, but not great, you know.
What was your major in college? Were you pursuing reporting back then?
I was actually a speech major. I read once that that's what Edward R. Murrow was, a speech major. And I was pretty good always at talking. And I could create a good image always in a speech, I think. And so I was in what they call radio TV with a major in speech. Yeah.
We usually hear colleges where young kids protest or they go wild. What were some of the biggest stories going on while you were in college? Do you remember that time?
You know, I was a jock really in college, you know. I never got into the protest movement or anything, although I had friends that went to different, you know, the whole protesting in the 60s, the anti-war movement, I mean, it was very heavy on the East Coast and the West Coast. And then, you know, by the time just about the time I graduated from college, it hit the Midwest, you know. And my wife was a year younger than I was. Her senior year, you know, there were the killings in Kent State in Ohio. And everybody at Miami University in Ohio, where we went, knew somebody who went to Kent State. So overnight, I went back to visit my wife, I remember, like a year later. And the whole campus changed. You know, like when I left and graduated in '69, you know, guys wore like, you know, slacks and kind of nice Gant shirts and things like that. And I went back, everybody had hair down to here and bell-bottom jeans and tie-dye t-shirts, you know, everything changed like overnight and everybody was really radicalized. And that year, like in 1970, you know, they burned down the ROTC Hall and there were all kinds of protests on campus and cops were on the campus, but I was gone by then, you know. So I wasn't real political in college. I was more of a jock, really. But I always really wanted to, at that point, really wanted to be a TV journalist. There were a lot of people in my family that were journalists, going way back. I mean, my great uncle was Charles Kickham, was part of the Fenian movement in Ireland. And he was a newspaper man, and he wrote a book called Knock na Gor, which was all about Irish folklore and how the people were mistreated by the English. And he actually served a couple of years in an English prison for his writings, you know. I had another cousin who worked for the New York World, which was the original Pulitzer paper in New York City, and he was full of stories all the time. And I had another cousin who worked at the Chicago Tribune, who was about 6 or 7 years older than I was, and I used to see his byline. It seemed like a great thing to be a part of what was happening in the world. You know, I can't imagine, and with no disrespect to an accountant or a lawyer or anything, but I can't imagine sitting in an office all day and like crunching numbers. I was never that good at math anyway, but it really appealed to me to get out in the world, you know, and talk to people. I've always been interested in people. Like my wife always teases me. We'll be like in a line at the airport or something waiting for a ticket, and she'll turn around and say, like, by the time we get to the front of that line, you're going to know everything about that guy in front of us in line, more than his wife knows, you know. I'm just very, very curious about people. I have a genuine interest, and when we came here, I started asking you guys things. I like to know where people come from, what they think, what they believe in. You know, it's something that makes the world go round. And everybody does have a story, you know. And the more I think that you were asking me about interviews, you know, like when you share a little bit of your life, you get back from people about their life, I think, you know. And that's one of the most valuable things you can do in an interview is open yourself up a little bit in a pre-interview so people sort of get to know you, and then you get a lot more back, you know.